In a little more than a year, North Carolina will again find itself in the national spotlight, the classic battleground state in the 2020 presidential election. Several of the Democratic primary candidates have already campaigned in our state, as has President Trump. A new poll by Harper Polling for the Civitas Institute gives us a snapshot of what would happen if the election were held today. Rick Henderson is editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. He's here to look at the latest data. Rick, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Donna.
Let's talk first about the presidential race. President Trump, how does he match up with some of these key Democratic candidates?
Still in the lead, but within the margin of error of all of them. The closest one, interestingly enough, is former Vice President Joe Biden would come within 1 percentage point of defeating President Trump. It's 45 to 44%. Bernie Sanders is 2 points down, Elizabeth Warren 3, and Kamala Harris 6. Again, all within the margin of error, but still a very close race as we have expected. And the more interesting thing to look for over time is not necessarily what the numbers are, because the election is not being held today. It's more than a year away, but how the trend lines go over time.
That's the interesting thing. We know that in 2016, the president won North Carolina. Many folks thought that he would lose North Carolina, but he pulled it out. But it wasn't a huge victory.
Right.
A number of states were won by just a few thousand votes. So at this point, anyway, it kind of feels like it's 2016 again.
Yeah, it really does. And it's interesting because the president will be certainly appearing here numerous times. It also feels like 2016 because you see in the two open congressional races that are going on right now in the 3rd District and the 9th District, the Republican candidates are tying themselves as closely as possible to President Trump, and their Democratic opponents also are tying the candidates as closely as possible to President Trump, but in a negative way. And so he is still the main issue in the 2020 campaign. There's no question about that. He's the dominant issue.
Now, we saw recently that the current lieutenant governor of North Carolina, Dan Forest, officially kicked off his campaign to be the Republican nominee for governor. Now, presumably, Roy Cooper will officially say he wants to run for re-election and will be the nominee of his party. Interesting in this poll from Harper Polling that they looked at a group of people that could cross lines. They could be Donald Trump voters and also Roy Cooper voters.
Right. If they broke this down regionally, it would be interesting because one would think that those voters somewhere between 8.5% and 12.5% most likely are concentrated in the eastern part of North Carolina. These are the old yellow dog Democrats that would, on the state level, vote for a Democrat, even if it was a yellow dog. But when the presidential election comes along, they're open to voting for a Republican because they think that the National Democratic Party is too far left.
Is it an issue of job security and the president's focus on what he calls America First, and he's now implementing trade policies that are protectionist, all under the moniker of "I'm going to protect your jobs from being moved overseas"?
Yeah, I mean, free trade has never been a popular issue, a wildly popular issue at any time, but it certainly has not been a really popular issue in North Carolina. North Carolina has relied very heavily on the support of different trade protections and things like that to attempt to keep various industries healthy. And so, from farming to manufacturing and things like that. What may be an interesting change in dynamic is the fact that the president's trade policies has led to some backlash in that some of our trading partners are responding by imposing tariffs of their own or banning the importation of U.S. products, and that seems to be affecting agriculture. But the farmers still, generally speaking, think that that's okay because the president seems to be fighting for them. That's the way they look at it. So it's an interesting viewpoint, and it will also be interesting to see if that actually holds over time, if the back and forth on trade has any kind of impact on whether or not the harvest is sold.
And there was also some money that was appropriated to give to farmers that were adversely affected by some of those trade policies. So that helps.
That's right. It helps some farmers. It's the question is more North Carolina's issue. Tobacco is not something that's covered by that. So for tobacco farmers, they get no help whatsoever from the federal government.
Rick, I think it's fascinating on this potential Trump-Cooper voter because For example, if you're Governor Cooper and you're out campaigning, presumably you would be saying negative things about Donald Trump, about the Republican president, because you would want your fellow Democrat, whoever the nominee is, to be elected president. So how do you walk that line if you know that there's a pretty good percentage there? It's single digits, but that's enough to turn an election.
Right.
How do you not turn someone off?
That's going to be a tough one because, I mean, that's an issue that the governor faces in a lot of different areas. For instance, he says that he's against corporate tax breaks or tax cuts for corporations. At the same time, he's handing out corporate welfare to companies he likes all over the place. You can say, well, he is opposed to the budget that was passed by the GOP-led General Assembly because it doesn't do enough to give teachers raises and things like that. But he vetoed the budget, and the longer that budget stays inactive, the longer it's going to take those teacher pay raises that are in there from taking effect. So, I mean, it's a difficult position to always be in opposition of everything the Republicans do, or seemingly so, even though they do work on some issues. But that constantly, the old Senator No thing that the people used to say about Jesse
Right.
Helms, Governor No may or may not be a very effective election strategy, and especially if Dan Forrest or whoever the Republican nominee eventually is comes forward with a more positive agenda.
And in fact, we know that State Representative Holly Grange also seeking
Yes.
the Republican Party's nomination for governor. So that certainly is not a lock for the lieutenant governor
Right.
to end up being the nominee. You mentioned issues that the governor and the legislature are disagreeing on, perhaps working on some things as well. We know that the discussion over expanding Medicaid in North Carolina is something they are definitely not on the same page about.
Right.
That has been a key issue as to why we have had this big kerfuffle over a new state budget. This poll by Harper Polling actually asked North Carolinians, do you want to expand Medicaid? And it's very interesting as people learn more about what Medicaid would do.
Right. The general question, do you favor Medicaid expansion in North Carolina, is 57% favorable, 27% unfavorable. But once the questioners start boring down a little bit into the details of what it would entail, for instance, the cost, and that
just a minor detail.
Right, right,
Yeah.
and that the most of the people receiving Medicaid would be healthy working age adults without children, then the people who said they would be likely to support it goes down almost to even. So I mean, it almost is a split question. Former Republican Party Executive Director Dallas Woodhouse put it this way: said, "Are people for free or ice cream, free beer, and a 3-day work week? Yeah, they are until they find out what it costs them."
And Rick, we can't end this interview without talking about a fascinating result in this poll having to do with the question of socialism, which we are now hearing a lot about from candidates who espouse that kind of belief system. We now know that here in North Carolina, fewer people are opposing socialism than they did earlier in the year. What do you make of that?
Well, part of it again is the fact that candidates on the Democratic side are saying things, making socialism sound really nice. They're making people think that it's just simply the kind of generous welfare state that takes place in Europe, where they don't have to pay for their own defense largely, and that type of thing. When they don't really say, no, this Venezuela and North Korea, that's socialism right there. That's not what it is. And so again, it's a question of framing as much as anything else. But it is a little bit disturbing that socialism does seem to maintain a lot of popularity.